Beds, bucks and bricks. Here we go again. Second instalment for anybody who may still be interested. I closed last time speaking about childhood illnesses and vaccinations, and I'll continue with that theme. Although there were now vaccinations for diseases such as diphtheria, children were still at risk of serious complications and even death from diseases like measles, mumps and whooping cough. Sadly, with some children not having the MMR vaccine nowadays, this is again becoming the case. When I had measles, I had to stay in a darkened room for some time because the light really hurt my eyes. Given that there was a possibility of serious eye problems, even blindness, as well as other complications and at worst death, it is no wonder that my parents were anxious. Most labourers and blue or white collar workers rented their homes, didn't own them. Very few people had or drove cars. Dad could have learned to drive while he was in the army during the war, but cars cost around a year's wages at that time, and Dad thought he would never be able to afford one, so he did not bother to learn to drive, either then or later, and in fact never did own a car. Ordinary working people didn't go abroad for holidays either. There were not all that many planes, and those that there were much smaller than now. There were no low-cost flights or package holidays. This will give you some idea of how expensive flying must have been when I was a child. Even by 1965, when I first went to America, airfares were terribly high. When we moved to the USA, I took Carl, then just 3 years old, on a charter flight, quite a bit cheaper than a scheduled flight, to Philadelphia, the only destination available to us. It cost £500 then, the equivalent of over £5,000 in terms of today's money, and we still had to get the rest of the way to Glasgow, Montana. There were no credit or debit cards, and there was very little borrowing, although some goods could be bought on hire purchase, or TIC as it was known colloquially, but this was rather frowned on. Most people saved until they had the money for what they wanted to buy, and didn't even have bank accounts. Their wages were paid in cash, and they made all their payments the same way. The rent collector came around weekly for his money, as did the insurance man or woman. I did not know anyone who had a home phone until after we moved to Stuartby, and then only those in quite high positions in the brick company. If you needed to make a telephone call, you had to use a public phone box. For example, if you needed the doctor urgently. If you had a less urgent medical problem, you just went down to the surgery, and it was first come, first seen. I was 6 years old before I even saw a television set. We didn't have one of our own until I was over 13 years old. The pictures were all in black and white. No colour ones. Also, the early sets were mostly really very bulky, and with tiny screens. That's how it was in those early years. At first the UK had just one channel, the BBC. BBC One, it would be now. Then by the time we had our rented TV, which stood on legs and had a rather smaller case and a bit bigger screen, there were BBC and the commercial channel ATV. That was it. On a weekday the programme started in the afternoon and ended at 11 p.m. when the channel stopped broadcasting. At a weekend I know there were some morning programmes too, at least by the time I was 10 years old, perhaps a bit earlier. We didn't have any remote controls, and both televisions and wirelesses were powered by valves, which could burn out and need replacing. They took quite a while to warm up too when you switched on. We had quite a sizable wireless, with a dial that lit up, and a number of knobs. I don't know what all of them were for. There were two main stations, both BBC. One was called the Home Service and the other the Light Programme. We mostly listened to the Light Programme. I suppose the Home Service was more serious, rather like Radio 4 is now. Auntie Nellie and Uncle Reg, of whom much more later, had a wind-up gramophone that played 78 RPM records. We had boxes of steel needles that had to be changed almost constantly it seemed. As the mechanism wound down, the record would get slower and the sound lower and more distorted. Wind it up again and the sound got higher and faster as you did so. Great fun for children. None of the houses that I knew had central heating in them. There was an open coal fire in the living room, which usually went out at night, and sometimes in other rooms too, although those would seldom be lit, only on special occasions. In the kitchen there was usually a boiler, which burned coke or anthracite. Both of these were treated harder and slower burning coal, and these heated the water. The boilers were generally rather like a large round black wood-burning stove, with a solid door very low down for taking out the ashes, and a lid on the top, where the fuel was poured in from a hod. The coal men delivered the fuel and emptied it from their sacks into the coal barn. Dad placed boards one above the other across the doorway to hold it in, as we always had a big load delivered in summer when it was sold at a discount. Gradually, as the coal stock went down, one board after another would be removed. The chimney sweep came in summer too. That was a really messy job in those days. There was no vacuum sweeping. Everything possible would be moved out of the living room, and all that could not be moved covered in old sheets to keep off the soot before the sweep started. He would push his sweeps brush, attached to the first pole, into the chimney. Then he would add one pole after another as he pushed upwards, until his brush came out the top. Sometimes, if we were at home at the time, if it was the summer holidays, we children would go outside and let him know when we saw the brush poking out. He did have a sack at the bottom of the chimney to catch most of it. That was kept to put on the garden or allotment as fertiliser. But after the sweep had gone, there was an awful lot of cleaning up still to do. The freestanding boiler chimney did not get such a build-up of soot, as coke and anthracite burned more cleanly, and nor was it such a mess when the sweep did get to it. Some houses still had a range in the kitchen, a coal fire with an oven built in alongside it. A kettle might sit on an iron trivet above the fire, which could also heat water in a boiler on the other side. You quite often see them depicted in old films. The ranges were cleaned with lead blacking, which was rubbed in well with a cloth and then polished to a shine. In the winter, everywhere except our living room and kitchen would be really cold, almost like being in a garage or shed. Ice crystals would form patterns on the inside of the windows when it was frosty, and there were times when, in the bedroom, we could see our breath as we exhaled. The outer walls of houses were largely built from 2 layers of brick mortared together. There was no insulation, not even an air gap between them. High up, one inner brick might be left missing from an outer wall of a room. This outer brick had a lot of little square holes through it for ventilation, and was known as the air brick. This was fine in the summer, but just added to the coldness in winter, so Dad would cut a piece of leftover linoleum to fit the gap, and wedge it against the air brick. This at least stopped the wind whistling into the room. We had no fitted carpets, just linoleum, lino, on the floor, with rugs. There was a rug next to the bed, and if your feet missed it on a winter morning, you knew it. Instead of duvets, we had sheets and blankets, with an eiderdown, a thick quilt, on top. Every night in winter we had a hot water bottle. The sheets were so cold until your feet got down to that. It was wonderful to feel its heat. In the winter we got undressed in the living room, and in the morning would hurry down there to get dressed. Although the fire would not have been lit for very long, there was some residual heat in the room from the night before. In the summer our living room fire would not be lit at all, and our boiler only once a week for baths and for washing clothes. The rest of the time water was boiled in a kettle on the stove for us to have a good wash over. The bathroom would be heated by an Aladdin paraffin stove in winter. Later, when I was about 13 years old, we had an electric wall heater in the bathroom. We also had an electric immersion heater fitted in the hot water tank, so we could have hot water all through the year without the boiler or a kettle. The first shower I saw was when I was 10 years old. There were 2 cold water showers in each set of changing rooms at Stuartby swimming pool, for rinsing off the chlorine. There were no automatic washing machines and no dryers. The whites, all cotton in the post-war years, would be boiled in a special washing boiler, which by now was at least electric. To make the white clothes brighter, Mum also added what was called a blue bag to their wash water. All the clothes when I was very young were rubbed on a scrubbing board to get them clean. Bar soap was used for this. The clothes and linen were taken out with long wooden-handled wash tongs to cool down enough to handle. After washing, and again after rinsing, they would be put through the 2 wooden rollers of a mangle, turned by hand to wring them out. The boiler, put on first thing in the morning, filled the kitchen with steam. Later, Mum had an electric washing machine, a tub with a paddle to agitate the clothes, and an electric mangle integral to it. But there was no automatic fill or empty, and no spin action. When spin dryers came along, they took out more water than the mangle, but you had to keep an eye on the outlet pipe in the sink. Had a habit of snaking out. Before I left home in the 60s, Mum had a twin tub washer, 1 tub to wash and 1 to rinse. You had to lift clothes from one tub to the other, but at least they did get spun in each tub, although still no automatic fill, and with a hose in the sink to empty water out. Washing powder was used in the machines, no liquids, tablets or fabric conditioner. If the weather was too bad to get the clothes dry outside, they were hung on a line in the kitchen, keeping it full of steam. Washing took up all Monday morning, and then the clothes had to be taken in off the line later and folded. There were very few synthetics and no easy care fabrics, so nearly everything needed ironing too. That was a job for Monday evening or Tuesday. Mum had an electric iron, but it had no thermostat and no steam, so ironing was quite a skilled job. With all this, it is little wonder that we did not change our clothes too frequently. Bedding was changed once a week, but only the bottom sheet from each bed was washed. The top sheet became the bottom sheet with a clean one over it. This was known to us as topping and tailing. Not quite sure why. All male office workers wore white shirts and a tie, hence the term white-collar workers. These white cotton shirts lasted longer and were freshened up between washes by having detachable collars. The collars and necks of the shirts had very small buttonholes in them. Little double-headed collar buttons, collar studs, passed through these holes to keep the collars in place, so just the collar could be changed daily, rather than the whole shirt. Those who could afford it might send washing to the laundry. It would be collected at the door and delivered back wrapped in brown paper tied with string. I only knew about this because, although Aunt Nellie washed most of the clothes herself, she did send the sheets, all flat white cotton or linen, no coloured or fitted ones, or, as I mentioned, easy care fabric, along with Uncle Reggie's butcher's overalls and aprons, to the co-op laundry once a week.